Hey YouTube, and welcome back to another tutorial. If what you're seeing looks interesting, stay tuned. Today we'll learn how to place enemies, make them move around the map, and set up skills so your combat can look just like this. So without further ado, let's jump right in. We will start things off by placing an enemy on the map. For this we'll just go to creations, basic creations, and let's take a basic Hilichurl, for example. And now if we actually want to beat him up, we can go over to the combat preset. Go right over here where the skills are, and I recommend starting out with the preset skills because there's pretty much a skill for every type of skill you can create right now. So let's just use the sword combo. Just press on it, click confirm create, and we have our skill. Now to actually equip the skill, go to your player and then onto class, and the second tab defines all the skills that you can equip. We have used the preset sword skills, so we can just press on no skills and add the sword combo. And with this being done, if we go to test play, then we can see we have already placed the Hilichurl. We have our sword combo. And we can beat the Hilichurl up. As you could see, this combat isn't really exciting. So let's dive deeper into how to actually give the Hilichurl a fighting chance and how to make your combat more exciting. First off, we will take a deeper look into the Hilichurl itself. And the Hilichurl is an entity just like every entity, and you will have the same 4 base tabs at the top, with the info just giving you basic information like the transform, what model is used, if you want to initially create the Hilichurl or if it should spawn later in. But what makes the creations actually unique is in the second tab. Here you can define the strength of the Hilichurl. By default, everything starts at level 1, and you can watch the view curve to decide what level you want to give your Hilichurl. But to keep things simple, I will just give him 200 base HP, and as you can see, it has like a 5 times multiplier, so he will end up with roughly around 1000 HP. So next up we have the aggro configuration, which in here is just a node. And then we have some standard settings where you can decide on its behavior, what it's supposed to do when it's not inside a battle. I recommend going into the edit details because in here you have the same settings as well, but with more context. So let's start with not in battle. We have the standing option, then we have a wandering option. If you enable this, then the Hilichurl will wander around a predefined space that you can see over here. And for most games, this is probably already enough, but if you want more control, then you can enable the patrolling option. And what patrolling allows you is to define waypoints where the Hilichurl has to move along. But since we haven't created any, let's create a basic patrolling template so you can see how it works. For that, press on Edit Details, click on the plus icon, and now we have a template. We want this to be effective. And now to make this template actually work, we have to create a patrol path. For that, we have to press over here. Then we can open the path management tool. And in here, we can create the path. Now to actually see the path details, we have to close this and this. And now pressing on the path actually opens up the path details. So what you see in here right now is the location of your path center point. Right now, we only have one waypoint. Therefore, these two match. But if we add, let's say, another waypoint, and another one, you can see that this changes as well. Let's zoom in a little bit. Now with these 3 waypoints, we could define how the Hilichurl moves. You can move them freely however you like and whatever fits your game. So, and with that being done, we already have a path configured. Let's jump back to the Hilichurl, go back to the edit details, into the edit details for the template. And now if we select a patrol path again, that we just created, we see a couple of options now, which is we can decide for each waypoint whether the Hilichurl needs to walk or maybe if it should run. So right now it will always run to the first waypoint, and then it will walk to the second and walk to the third waypoint. However, since we only have a one-way type, it will only run to the waypoint, which we will most likely not see because the Hilichurl loads in probably before the loading screen disappears for us. So what we can do is instead of a one-way point, we can decide whether to have a round trip or a loop. But the round trip makes your Hilichurl walk from waypoint 1 to 2 to 3 and then back to 2 and 1. And then it repeats that process over and over again. Whereas in the loop, it will run from 1 to 2 to 3 and then from 3 back to 1. So it will do one whole loop, and it will choose the closest possible path to run from 3 to 1 again, because there could be things blocking the Hilichurl. To actually see the run in effect, let's just set 2 of these to run and then have a quick test. And now, as you can see, it will run to the second and first waypoint, but will walk to the third. Alright, so these are the settings when you're not in battle. You could also have him emote, just sleep, sit, or dance around. But the two settings you most likely want to set up are either wandering, or you can have it patrol. Alright, next up is the combat tab. And in here you can basically define at what range the Hilichurl engages in combat, which would be the entering battle zone. You can choose between range detection or field of view detection, or you can have it both enabled. Then you can define the range, which is highlighted by the yellow dome right now. And there's something called the chain engagement distance. And what this does is, if we enable the preview for that, then what we could theoretically do is have a second Hilichurl standing right over here inside the second dome. So, and if we now engage with this Hilichurl inside this chain reaction dome, then the first Hilichurl will also start attacking us, even though the Hilichurl itself does not see us yet. So this is what a chain engagement does. And the next one is, how far do you have to run before the Hilichurl stops following you? And to round the Hilichurl up and to move into our own skills, let's look at the Hilichurl skills. Each creation has its own set of skills, and for the Hilichurl we have a melee skill, a ranged skill, and a special skill. And what you can do is define the cooldown on how often the Hilichurl attacks when it is able to use a special skill for the first time, as highlighted in the initial cooldown. And yes, that's basically all you need to know to creations. So make sure to tweak the combat engagement settings, how it should patrol around your map, or if it should just wander or maybe even sleep around. And the final settings you would have to tweak are the actual basic attributes so that your Hilichurl doesn't die in one hit. Alright, next up we will cover the skills, and Miliastra Wonderland differentiates between 5 skill types. We have instant, normal, hold, combo, and aiming. And as you can see, the sword is a combo skill. If we press on the drop down, we can see the other types. So to showcase each of them, we will use a preset for each, and then we will also change a little bit so you can actually see how you would go on and alter these skills to match your preferences. So for this purpose, since we already have the sword combo, we'll also use the horizontal sprint. Then we'll use the aerial charge. We will use bow aiming. And lastly, we'll use the apply status. And the reason for these 5 skills are simply because the sword is a combo skill, the horizontal sprint is a normal skill, the apply status is an instant skill, then we have an aiming skill and a hold skill. To each skill, there's usually 3 components we have to keep in mind. The first is the skill property pane in itself, where we have basic settings like enable fall protection or allow to cast in midair. The fall protection basically just stops your character from running off edges when you have, for example, the bow skill and you're charging a bow, so you do not run off. And allow cast in midair basically means when you're in the air you can just cast your skill. So next up we have a numerical configuration. We can enable a cooldown, how long this cooldown is supposed to be. Then we have a usage limit. For example, I could define that I can only use my skill 1 time or like any amount of time. And the resource consumption, what this does is it lets you define your own resources. You would have to define them right over here in the resource management. And what you can do is, for example, you could define mana and then your skill would cost, let's say, 30 mana and you have 100 mana by default. So next thing, we'll have the targeting range. And what this does is, this is where your skill would lock onto, if it can do that. For example, if you have, let's open these skills again. If you take the sword, you see the targeting range is quite large. And this is where your character would launch forward to if an enemy is inside of this range. All right, let's go back in here. So you can define the radius and the height of that targeting range, but we don't really need it for the apply status, so that one is just 1. And lastly, we have the life cycle management over here. And this is very similar to the usage limit, but when it reaches 0, then this skill will be destroyed and disappears from your UI. So this is the first of the 3 things you have to keep in mind. The second one will be the animation editor. And since the apply status is an instant skill, there's not much in here. And that's also the reason why I started with that one. And what this timeline does, it has the start event track. And in here there's a node graph reference for your skill that executes as soon as you press the skill. And if you're wondering where to find those node graphs, let's head over to the sandbox. And to actually see the skills, let's head over to window and press on Client Node Graph Resource Explorer. Alright, and inside the Client Node Graph Resource Explorer, we can go to Skill Node Graph, go to the and Categorize tab, and then suddenly we have a whole bunch of Client Node Graphs. Let me clean this up a little bit, and then I'll be right back. Alright, this is much more manageable. If we now press on the Apply Status, then you can see what's actually going on. So the moment you press your skill button, this node graph will start over here. And the Apply Status just adds a unit status. And this unit status will give us 40% increased speed. And it will play this timed effect over here. To refresh your minds a little bit, to set up a skill, we have to go to Class, inside the Skill tab. Then we can add an active skill. So since we have multiple, let's set it to 3 for now. And now we can go and press on the plus icon. And now we have the Apply Status, the horizontal sprint movement, and the aerial charge. And as you can see, there's also a custom skill button. Let's add one to that. And now we can go and add the final skill, the bow aiming. So before we go into the next skills, let's shortly explain what a custom button skill is. To actually customize this, we'll have to go to the Manage UI control groups. And then we can add a UI control and add an interactive button. So I will not probably configure what it's supposed to look like, but just for demonstration purposes, this button now is mapped to the 1 key or left on the control pad, and instead of an interactive event, we'll use the button skill. And we can set it to the custom skill slot 1. And what this does is now it will map this button over here to this skill slot. All right. Now we have learned how to play skills, how to use custom skill buttons, and how skills are put together. Let's level up a little bit and go from the instant skill to the normal skill. As you can see, it has the same configurations over here, but if we now press on the animation editor, there is quite a bit more. So let's break down piece by piece what we're actually seeing. Over here, we'll see the actual animations that are placed. So we have the general horizontal movement 1. And if we press play, we can actually see what our animation looks like. As you can see, this is 0.56 seconds long. And previously we only had the start event track, but now we also have an end event track. And this will highlight exactly how long our skill is. As you can see, it ends at roughly, well, actually at exactly 0.56. So if we now take this and move it along, we can see the full first animation. And after that, it starts at this pink dot and ends with that one. We'll see the second part of the animation, which is the general horizontal movement postcast. We also have now a node graph event. So we could take this node graph and put it directly at the start or at the end of our first animation. But having an extra node graph track, generally speaking, gives us more flexibility. So the first 3 tracks are basically the same thing we saw at the instant skill. And now we have 3 more lanes. And if you want to add a new track, you can always press here on the plus new track, and then you can see we have node graph event tracks. This is the one where our node graphs are placed. And then we have new status track, and these are the other 3. If you press right click, you can add an event to a status track. And these are all the events that you can place. We'll go through each of them in their respective skills, but for now, let's focus on what is in here. So we see this green track, and this starts at roughly 0.28 seconds and then goes all the way until the first animation ends. And what allow interruption does is basically when you play this animation and you go right at this point, now you could input a movement, and then after 0.3 seconds, which is when this animation ends, your character will start moving again without playing the general horizontal movement postcast animation. So in my opinion, you could also just put this into one. This second track allows you to interrupt your skill by sprinting, by jumping, or by gliding. And if we put this like at the very beginning and try to jump now, your skill would still play out, but the animation is stopped and you will be launched forward with a jump. I mean, that can look cool depending on what you want to do. Keep in mind that this one will still play out unless you manage to press the button in that 0.05 of a second before the node graph is played. But in that case, you could also just put it right over here. In that case, this node graph will always execute no matter what. And the final track has allow skill release. And the difference between allow interruption and allow skill release is that allow skill release allows you to interrupt the animation by using another skill. So for example, if I was to move this to the very beginning, I could now use my sword attack to interrupt the dash. Right, and this is basically all you need to learn about normal skills. Now with the 2 basic skills done, let's go into the more spicy skills. So let's go into the animation editor. And what's new now is we have this combo track, since the sword combo consists of 3 hits, which is the first hit, second hit, and third hit. As you can see, we have sword normal attack 1, sword normal attack 2, sword normal attack 3. Theoretically, we could also change this now into a claymore normal attack, so that would look something like that. So the issue with that is though, the animation doesn't really match our VFX. This is because the swing animation is handled in the node graph and it is set up for normal sword. So let's undo the claymore again. This is how you can exchange animations, and this can make sense if you want to set up like a custom string of attacks. So let's take a closer look at the combo track, because that one is the new one. We now have a pre-input, then we have so-called transition settings. And what this means is, so starting from this point, if the player now presses the button, it will transition from the first attack directly to the second attack. And if we are a little bit late, and we already reached this point where the character drops the weapon, then instead of transitioning to the second attack, we would start from the first attack again. And it has this setup for each of the 3 attacks. So here again we have a pre-input. The pre-input lets us do the charge attack. So if we hold our mouse button while in the pre-input, then instead of transitioning to another normal attack, we would transition into the charge attack. And if we are right here, then we would go from the second attack to the third attack. And if we press as late as this, where the sword is dropped, then we would transition back to the first normal attack. So that's basically how the combo track works. So for the new thing, weapon models in Genshin Impact are actually not hard models, but VFX effects. And if you want, for example, a different sword, you can just press on here and type in sword. There's 7 swords in total, and we could just use sword 6. And now, as you can see, we have this different sword model. Keep in mind though, if you want to change a sword model, now this is changed for the first attack animation, and for the second, we are back to sword 1. So we'd have to change the sword model for each of the 3 attacking animations. Another thing you can do, if you do not want the character to suddenly lose the sword mid-animation, you could just drag this all the way, and now that sword would be visible for the entire duration. So depending on what look you want to go for, keep that in mind. If you've played around in Miliastra Wonderland for a little bit, then you might have thought that the initial sword combo is a little bit too slow, and you might have thought about making the animation faster or more snappy. So there's 2 ways you can achieve that, but the first way I would not recommend is by shortening the duration of the animation. So for example, if I put this now to 1 second, then you can see that this timeline shrinks down, and now it does this animation and it stops already at this point. But that whole ending transition where the character goes properly back is now missing. So I would not recommend actually shortening the duration. What I would instead do, if you actually want more snappy combat, is to take that transition phase and move it much earlier. This way you can attack faster, and now you do not have to wait the whole pre-time, and you can immediately go into the second phase. So this might be a bit too fast, but right about here would be right at home. And you can see by default it's like all the way over there, even though right here the attack animation already ended and we're no longer attacking. So this is what I would recommend. Just look where the end of the attack animation is and then move that transition phase closer to the front. So another thing you might have noticed that we have much more node graph events. So turn towards target is what you see at the beginning of each of these slashes. And then you have sword combo 1, sword combo 2, and sword combo 3. So, and each of these sword combo do the following. They trigger a sector hitbox at a specified attachment point, and then they play a timed effect. And this timed effect is the slashing animation that you saw earlier. So, and to give you a little bit extra, let's have a look at this node graph, because this is how the damage is defined of your sword hit. And you will see this node everywhere where you have an entity that can do damage. So let's get familiar with that. First off, you can choose who to target, all except self. If you make a skill and you use the preset skill, keep in mind that you can hit your allies as well. So maybe you just want to put it to hostile factions for that. Then we have an attachment point name. So in this case, it is put to GI chest. So it's the upper area. Then we have a slight offset because we want to hit in front of us. Then we have a damage coefficient and a damage increment. This is a multiplier and this is a hard damage increment. So for example, if I put 100 in here, we would hit 100 damage more, put this back to 0. Then we have a trigger type. There's 2 settings, once per life cycle and once per entity. And what this means is once per entity, if there's 2 Hilichurls, let's say, in our sword hit range, we will hit both of them. And if we had only once per life cycle, then after the first entity hit, like the first Hilichurl, the second attack wouldn't register anymore. Then we have an on-hit scene effect. That doesn't really matter for the sword, but what this does is it plays a VFX effect if our sword was to collide with the ground or any of the scene elements. So these points actually define the hitbox. So in that case, we have a sector hitbox with a height of 2. That is roughly the size of our character. Then we have the angle in which we can hit. It's like full 360 degrees. Then we have the actual radius of the hitbox, like how far in front of us we reach. There's no inner radius. In this case, we could make the hitbox look like a donut. I think that's the easiest to explain it. So now we have the detection direction. So we have from inside out, clockwise or counterclockwise. So for the sword attack, basically just want to have it go out from our character and then onto the next enemy. Clockwise would make sense if we have like a blade that rotates around us. Think of Xiangling ultimate. So next we can make a filter, what we can actually hit. So in this case, we can only hit a hurt box on an entity. All creations have by default a hurt box, but if you want to hit, let's say, an object, then you would actually have to add the hurt box. Otherwise, here we could define only hit the scene. That doesn't really make sense. And then hit everything. We could also make like an extra attack list, but we don't really need that. So here we can define the elemental type. For example, if we want to make our elemental type pyro, we can just use pyro in here. Keep in mind, we'll have to do this for each sword combo hit. Then we can increase the elemental attack potency. And this doesn't increase the damage, but how much it reacts to other elements. And this is best explained by hitting the Fatui shields. So depending on how high your potency is, you will decrease that shield by a greater margin. Then we have different hit types. Depending on your hit types, it will interact with certain objects or weaknesses differently. So next up, you can define if it's a melee attack or a range attack. Then the interrupt value, what this does is whether an enemy gets staggered when you hit them, or if he's just like unfazed and you hit him and he still moves as if nothing happened. For example, in my gameplay demonstration, the enemies were juggled into the air, and that's because I put a very high interrupt value in there. So absolute damage, if we enable this, then this means our damage ignores the enemy's defensive stats. So the on-hit special effect displays as soon as your attack connects to an enemy. Then we have a whole lot of knockback orientation. And what these do is basically in what direction an enemy gets sent based on the attack. So by default, it's just a line between the attack and the hit point. And you can play around with these to make your attacks unique. So here you can define whether the damage is shown on a block. Now you could also define an offset for each of the hit effects. If you find an EFX that maybe sits a little bit too far to the left or right, then you could change that over here. Zoom just makes it bigger. So each hit has a certain aggro multiplier, and let's say we increase this to 5, then you could basically make a tank class that as soon as he hits an enemy always gets the aggro. That's what this is used for. Here again, it's a hard increment, and then we can define the hit levels. So we have a light hit, light tremor, a knockback hit, and a launch. And if you take basic Genshin combat, then you can see that the Hilichurl is just getting hit, but he's a little bit phased, and that's about it. And if you compare it to my gameplay, I used the launch option, for example, and cranked those numbers up quite a bit. And it sets the enemies flying because I really like that feeling, being able to juggle enemies. So that's how you would do it. So this node graph was kind of a mouthful, but I hope this made things clearer. Before I forget it, there's also the charging branch. And this is basically the EFX and the animation that plays when you hold the skill right over here in the pre-input combo response event. So it would jump from this animation over to here, and then you have the same things, basically allow interruption in different ways, here by sprint, jump, glide, over here by movement. As soon as you release a skill, we have turn towards target again, and this one is the sword charge attack. Now there's 2 more skills, but they don't really bring that much new. As you can see, this one is designed to enable fall protection. It looks almost the same as the sword combo, but it has a couple of new events, and instead of a combo track, it has this branch track over here, but it works pretty much the same. What this does is the area charge attack has a charging level, so if you hold the button, this one will fill up, and as soon as you reach this spot, roughly after 4 seconds, you'll reach charge level 2, and based on which charge level you reach, it will either use this node graph, or if we go over here to charge level 2, it will use the other node graph. So for my taste, I think 4 seconds is a little bit long, so I would just put this down and I can show you what this looks like if we change the charge level to a lower value. But now to make this work, we'll actually have to also put this VFX further forwards, because that's the surrounding effect we can see right here. And then we have the starting charging effect. So if we now look into the node graph again, since we've already looked at the sword, this one will be pretty familiar. It's the exact same as we had with the sword, just with different values. And as you can see, this, for example, has an element type electro, and afterwards it plays this electroshock wave effect. So if we now wanted to change it to, let's say, hydro, we could just go over here, change it to hydro, change this one to hydro shockwave. And then we would have to change these two VFX as well to have like the blue surrounding buff and the hydro surrounding effect. And then this new skill would look something like that. One final thing that is unique to this skill, the character has a slight hovering movement. This actually comes because of the looping animation, which will put the character in midair. So to actually move while we are hovering, this character hovering movement is actually needed. So in here we could define the speed, how fast we can move while we are chanting, and this already sums up the area charge. So now there is one final skill, which is the bow aiming. And if you've already played around with that a little bit, then you might have come across that it just doesn't work the same way as it does in the main game. And this is simply because the bow by default uses a toggle instead of a hold. And if you swap this to a hold, you can just release the button instead of having to confirm with your left click or with the normal attack button. So, and if we go to the animation editor again, then this looks pretty much the same as the aerial charge. We have this yellow track, this branching track, and depending on what type of charge level we are, that we can swap over here, we will have a different charge attack. And the only thing that really is added new is we have now multiple VFX effects, because we have one for the arrow that comes up, one for the bow, and one for the little glowing effect. And then we have two more status tracks, which is the enter aiming state. So in the enter aiming state status track, we can define what the camera looks like when we're actually holding the skill. The field of view just zooms in and out for us. We can slightly offset it by left, right, up, down, forward or back. And then we have pitch angle, which basically says how far we can look up and down while we are holding the skill. And then the transition duration is how long it takes for the camera to move from this view into this view. That's what the enter aiming state does. And lastly, there is the show crosshair, and this is just reflected in the crosshair that is shown. So this would cover all these skills. To summarize things, I recommend downloading a preset, then going from that preset and define the basic configuration that you need. And then inside the animation editor, you could decide how fast you want to attack, what node graph is supposed to be used when you actually press the button, then the VFX for the visuals. And then to smooth things out, you can allow to use different skills at certain timings. And once you're done with the animation editor, you go over to your node graph, and then you define how the sword attack actually impacts your enemy. So, and when all things are done, you can create a combat that looks maybe something like that, or do your own unique spin on it. I hope this tutorial helped you understand how to set up skills, how to define them in your class, and then actually set them up for your character. And if this tutorial was useful to you, please leave a like and subscribe. I would also be happy to read your comments. And with that being said, I'll see you in the next video.